Right, good morning out there, and welcome to the next in this series of GRDC sponsored What's New in Weeds webinars. This is Mark Convery from ICANN, and with me I've got Andrew Somervaille from Jubilee Consulting. We're coming to you from Toowoomba. Andrew's been working in the industry, working with glyphosate since its introduction over 30 years ago. What we wanted to talk about today in the webinar is looking at glyphosate, managing our best tool that we've got in our shed, and particularly there's lots of things we could talk about. We really want to focus on the performance of the different salts and adjuvants and how they mix in the spray tank and focus on that part of making glyphosate work. So what we wanted to really focus on today is really focus on glyphosate, as I mentioned before, as one of our most valuable tools. And it's going to remain critical to our farming system, despite the levels of resistance that we're starting to see. It will remain critical for a number of years. So we really want to maximise the performance we can get out of glyphosate. And by maximising the performance, hopefully we're going to stay one step ahead of resistance, or at least help assist us in achieving that. So to focus on optimising glyphosate, it's really a combination between the actual glyphosate acid molecule, the surfactants that build up the formulation, the environment, and the weeds. And so that's really what we want to focus on in the next 30 minutes or so that we've got available to us today within the webinar timeframe. So I've just covered this. We talk about the different formulations that are available to us. We'll talk about the adjuvant systems that the manufacturers use, both to build the formulations in the can and then also what we can do from a tank mix point of view. We'll lead into water quality, and we'll talk a little bit about incompatibility and mixtures and some of the issues that we need to be aware of and potentially avoid as we start using this out in the field. So, Andrew, I want to kick over to you now. We know when we put glyphosate out into the plant, it gets into the plant and it moves into its acid phase, and that's what actually works in the plant and kills the weeds. But we don't apply glyphosate as an acid, we apply it as a salt formulation. So, Andrew, can you explain the different salt formulations that are out there, how they differ, and some of the different properties that we're dealing with, and why we actually formulate as a salt in the first place?
Good morning, everybody. Well, like many other weak acid herbicides, glyphosate, its parent form is in the form of an acid. But because of its very low solubility, 12 grams per litre, this makes it totally unsuitable for as a sprayable formulation, but also from the point of view of uptake. So it generally requires it to be formulated as what's called a monoanionic salt to assist not only spraying but lead penetration. There were some early experiments done with ester formulations of glyphosate, but these had no particular practical advantage or economic advantage over the salt. So the most common salt that you'd be familiar with would be the isopropylamine salt. Now, the solubility of the salts, of course, dictates the amount of glyphosate that you can actually get into the can itself. So that's why there's been quite a lot of interest in developing salts that allow for much higher loaded formulations. So some of these salt formulations, I mentioned isopropylamine, that's the one that was originally formulated when the product was launched in 1976, and that covered brands such as Roundup, Roundup CT, Roundup Bioactive, etc. Now the practical limitation of isopropylamine is that it can only be loaded up to a maximum of 572 grams per litre. That's without any surfactant containing in it at all. And so from the formulation point of view, the Roundup CT formulation 450 was almost the upper limit of what you could get, and also formulate surfactants in with it. Now, some of the other salts that were tried along the way were the dimethylamine salts. There was one in Australia called Davison 300D that was around in the 80s, but didn't persist. Dow worked with a product called River 480 Flexi, and that was commercialised in the US, but not in Australia. And then you've got the dry glyphosate formulations, which are mainly formed around monoammonium salt, and the most readily identifiable example of that from a proprietary point of view is Roundup Ready Roundup Ready Plant Shield. And in addition, we had some other liquid formulations, the monoethanolamine, which was the original Roundup Max formulation. There are still a couple of generic formulations registered as monoethanolamine salts. They had a slightly higher loading. You'll recall perhaps that Roundup Max was 510 gram per litre, so you can see there was a trajectory to increase the concentration there. Potassium salts have become, in recent years, the go-to salts from the point of view of getting very high loaded formulations. So typically they're anything from 500 for the touchdown high-tech formulation that was around for a while, right up to, I think there are some that are 600 gram per litre. Of course, Roundup Ultramax is at 570. In addition to that, we had sodium salts, which were a dry formulation. They were not ever commercialised in Australia, but they were tested. And of course, would not be I'd be neglectful not to mention some of the others. Monotrimethyl-sulfonium, the TMS salts, that's the Roundup, the touchdown broadacre formulations, and the original touchdown formulations used those. That was a liquid formulation. And then we've got the blends that that New Farm have developed, the ammonium isopropylamine, Weedmaster Duo, ammonium plus potassium, Weedmaster DST, and most recently the potassium plus isopropylamine, Weedmaster Argo. So you can see there's quite a suite of salt formulations out there, or have been out there in the marketplace over the period of years. Now, just to put some bones on that aspect of solubility, you'll notice, as I've mentioned before, that glyphosate acid has a solubility of 12 grams per litre. I've just put calcium salt there as a reminder to the, and it's a lead into a discussion a bit later on about water quality. The formation of calcium salts of glyphosate in spray solution obviously is quite detrimental. You can see that practically here because of the calcium salt solubility being quite low. Ammonium salts, 300 grams per litre, that's the dry glyphosate formulations predominantly. Isopropylamine, it said 500 grams per litre, but I did say that we could get right up to 572. You start getting crystallisation around that point. Sodium salts, again, not ones that were formulated commercially, but 500 grams per litre solubility. And then, of course, you can see straight away that potassium salts offer the greatest potential to produce a high-loaded formulation.
So the obvious question there, Andrew, is, do these different salts give us different weed control?
Well, of the commercial formulations, the bottom line is it's really more to do with the adjuvant system that goes with the salts rather than the salts themselves. Now, of course, practically this is a very difficult comparison to make with trials, because you can't make an isopropylamine salt with taloamine and compare it with a potassium salt with taloamine, because the latter cannot physically be produced. So it's very difficult to actually make those comparisons, but there's consensus amongst those that have researched this area is that the salts themselves make very little difference to the performance of the formulations. And I can relay from first-hand experience, having done a lot of formulation screening over the years, that it's really the adjuvant system that goes with these formulations that dictates as to whether these formulations will meet the standard that's been set by the original isopropylamine plus taloamine ethoxylate formulations.
So obviously there's a lot of different types of formulations that we can use. Do you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on what's out there and what's available and what gets used in what situations?
Well, I've already intimated that the taloamine surfactants were the ones that were originally used with glyphosate formulations. They were one of many that were screened when the product was first developed, and it was the one that was shown to be the most efficacious or most effective over a widest range of weed types that were present. So in that group also you've got what's called alkylamine and alkylethyramine. You might recall that the very earliest high-loaded formulation, which was a 490 gram per litre formulation, used the alkylethyramine. That's using a synthetic base rather than the tallow base. One little point about the tallow base is that it is not an amorphous single product, so a taloamine ethoxylate can have different characteristics according to the makeup of the amino acids that are
actually present in the tallow. So that's something to point out. What has happened, of course, over time is people have looked at alternate surfactants, and the first requirement came along when we discovered that the tallow-amine ethoxylates were quite toxic to some aquatic life, and so there was interest in developing less toxic formulations from the point of view of surfactants, and they included these things that are now called quaternary amines, the alkyl betanes, which are widely used in the generic glyphosate production. They have the advantage of having low toxicity, both from a human health point of view, from an eye toxicity point of view, but also from an aquatic tox. So you'll find that a lot of formulations that utilise alkyl betanes will have all the aquatic registrations that the likes of the traditional formulations no longer have. Some of the other products that are used or have been used in the past, the alkyl polyglycoside, or a sugar surfactant, was used in the Touchdown high-tech formulation and the Roundup and the Touchdown broadacre formulations before that. They haven't been used very widely. They do have some disadvantages apart from their advantages. So they don't find themselves in any of the current formulations, to my knowledge. Alcohol ethoxylates, and the most common of those is the one in the additive type that we use from time to time, BS1000, Chemwet 1000, etc. There's a whole suite of those. They tend not to be used on their own. They are successful in combinations with various other surfactants to provide an efficacious formulation. And then we have some other products such as the alcohol ethoxylate phosphate esters. Bearing in mind, of course, it's very difficult to discover what's actually in some of these formulations. It's not disclosed, being company confidential in most cases. So it's not always possible to identify what is actually there. And of course, there are a lot of blends, and of course, with the proprietary formulations of things like Roundup Ultramax, the Weedmaster DST, etc., they tend to use blends of surfactants rather than a single surfactant. Now, what makes a good surfactant? And that's an interesting question. It is still the case that the original formulations based on the tallow-amine ethoxylate set a pretty high bar for performance. I'd have to say that the proprietary formulations, because of the way they've developed with much more rigorous testing, at least meet the standard, if not slightly exceed the standards that were set by the standard formulations such as Roundup CT and before that Roundup. There are certain weeds that seem to be more responsive to specific surfactants, and we do know that the tallow-amine ethoxylates are particularly good on the grasses. Walnut barnyard grass is one that I'd include in that, but grasses overall across the board tend to be more responsive to that, and certain broadleafs as well. South thistle, a case in point. Now, there are other surfactants that are used in commercial formulations that, while they be quite successful in a whole range of weeds, they do have certain weaknesses. And I found that the alkyl betanes, while they're quite good on the grasses that are common in southern Australia and also the winter growing grasses, things like ryegrass and silvergrass, wild oats, volunteer cereals, etc., they're not so good on some of our summer grasses such as Walnut barnyard grass. So there can be some instances where formulations based on the alkyl betanes don't meet the standards that are set by the tallow-amine ethoxylate formulations or those that are proprietary in nature.
So the obvious question that comes from that, is there any way, if we're out in the field and we've got a formulation, we can actually have any understanding of what type of surfactant is likely to be in that formulation?
Well, as far as the standard generic formulations, I think the one, I guess, telltale sign would be whether there is an aquatic claim on the label. Now, that's not to say that people may decline to have an aquatic claim anyway, but products that have aquatic claims are those that don't contain tallow-amine ethoxylates. So they would have to include alternates such as the alkyl betanes or the quaternary amines. So that would be one indirect way of establishing whether tallow-amine ethoxylate is being used. for those in the know, there are certain ways you can smell the formulation. I don't do this at home, everybody, but having used the tallow-methoxylate formulations over the years, they do have quite a distinctive odour. It's not very strong, and you'll notice straight away if you're using something that's using a different surfactant that it won't have that same amine type odour associated with. Another way that used to be quite useful in the winter time is the viscosity of the solution. Viscosity can tell us two things, or actually three things. It can tell us something about the salt, the loading. It can tell us something about the surfactant loading. The higher the surfactant loading, the more viscous it's likely to be, and also the surfactant type. The tallow-methoxylates tend to be more viscous under cold conditions, although there are different grades of them, so they have adapted to make them more cold-friendly, if you like. But some of the amphoteric, the alcohol betaine type surfactants tend to have much slower viscosity under cold conditions. So that's a practical advantage, of course, but it also tells us something about the nature of the formulation.
Right, so I guess that's sort of a little bit on the different formulations we've got available to us. I think in the time we've got left in the webinar, we sort of move on to talk a little bit about water quality and sort of touch on the suspended clay content. I'll let Andrew talk to that. Some comments maybe around pH, and we'll move on to water volume and finish up with hardness. So Andrew, first up, clean water. How important is that with glyphosate?
Well, it's an aspect of water quality that's very hard to quantify. Turbidity is the only measure that you can get from a water test, and it really doesn't tell you all the information that you would need to know. Suffice to say that it's one of those things that you can avoid having some doubt about by just not using water sources which have a high content or a content of suspended clay and organic matter, which doesn't allow you to the solution. So I have used in experimental situations water that does contain suspended clay and not seen any reduction in performance, but the wise thing to do is to avoid that altogether, because the possibility is, of course, that glyphosate is adsorbed to clay particles, and for all the amounts that are adsorbed, they're not available for uptake by the plant. Similarly for organic matter, and it's probably just best to deal with this by saying use clean water wherever possible, and if you don't have access to clean water, is to use some method of settling out water, such as alum sulphate, to enable you to do that. Now, as far as water pH is concerned, there's been a lot said over the years as to the importance of water pH. Just a little bit of chemistry, just for background. Glyphosate has three what's called pKa's. These are points at which a hydrogen ion is liberated from the molecule, and those pHs are at 2.3, 5.6 and 10.2. Now, most of our water is going to be found in the range of around about 5 to 9. And so that only occupies our mind when we talk about the pKa 5.6. What's been established over the years with experimental work is that independent of the effect of presence of divalent ions such as calcium, magnesium, water pH does not have a great deal of effect on the performance of glyphosate. And in fact, if you were to look at the plot of glyphosate concentration and water, you'll find that as glyphosate's added to alkaline water, that the pH quite markedly drops close to the level at which glyphosate itself in the liquid formulation has pH. So glyphosate as a liquid formulation has pHs somewhere around about 4.4 to 4.6, some as low as 4.2. Solution containing glyphosate generally has a pH around about the 5. So from that point of view, there's no real need to acidify water, if you want to put it that way. There could be some other advantages of using compounds that do acidify water by way of dealing with the calcium and magnesium content. But from adjusting the pH point of view, there's no particular advantage in doing so. Now, just moving on to water volume, and there was a lot of good work done early in the piece with water volume, establishing that in low water volumes, glyphosate is far more effective than it is in high water volumes, and physics behind that is simply that with a higher concentration and gradient between the cuticle, the outside, the external part of the leaf, and the internal part of the plant, the better the rate of flow of glyphosate across that barrier. And that's independent, of course, of any other adjuvants. But put simply, in low volumes, and we know how effective spray drift is, glyphosate tends to be much more effective, all other factors being equal. Now, I've already mentioned hardness. Calcium, magnesium are the two major divalent ions of concern there, but we also can't ignore sodium, and they all contribute to the formation of salts of those particular compounds: calcium salts of glyphosate, magnesium salts of glyphosate, and sodium salts, which are somewhat less soluble in the case of calcium and magnesium. Iron's also occasionally a problem, but the most common ions found in solution tend to be calcium and sodium. So that's the reason for the reduction in performance of glyphosate in hard water. It's due to the combination of those, the formation of glyphosate salts that are less effective than those that the glyphosate is formulated as. At high levels, sodium can be quite antagonistic, and when I talk about high levels, I'm talking around about 500,000 parts per million plus of sodium. They can be antagonistic, although sodium is less antagonistic than calcium by virtue of its lower ionic strength. So how do we deal with those problems? Some of you will be familiar with the use of ammonium sulphate, which has been around for a long time. And the benefit of ammonium sulphate is twofold, in that you can get the formation of calcium sulphate, magnesium sulphate, which is not available, which takes the calcium out of solution, in other words, and also the benefit of the presence of ammonium ions, which can facilitate more effective glyphosate uptake independent of water quality. Some of the other acids that are useful as a sequestering agent, or agents that remove calcium and magnesium from solution, include sulfuric acid, oxalic acid, citric acid, and a compound called EDTA. I won't attempt to pronounce that, but sometimes used in formulations to counteract the adverse effect of calcium salts. Just to put some numbers on this, and this data is provided by New Farm with permission, it does show the effect of the addition of ammonium sulphate, or in this case liase at 2%, to round up DST, looking at winter grass weeds. So these would be volunteer cereals, wild oats, and phalaris. You can see even in the presence of soft water, which would be just tap water in this instance, at marginal use rates we do get an increment of activity that's increased with the addition of liase. But particularly with hard water, and this is a very extreme version of hard water, it's what's called HU2 water, where it's built up to 1,000 parts per million of hardness, which is pretty atypical for most underground water sources, but it's not impossible to get that. You can see that the very marked improvement from about 58% up to 98% control with the addition of ammonium sulphate. Now, there is such thing as an ammonium sulphate calculator, and by and large I think the bottom line of this is that for most common garden variety additions of ammonium sulphate, 1% of the crystalline form or 2% of the liquid, that we're well catered for from the point of view of taking up those effective calcium, sodium, potassium and magnesium ions that might be present in spray solution. But this was developed in North Dakota a number of years ago using volunteer cereals as an agent, and what was discovered is that there are a certain ratio of certain factors that can be multiplied together, and you can read those at your leisure later on, but you can take a water test, for example, and get the values for calcium, sodium and magnesium. It's unlikely you'll find anything with potassium, and then calculate what the minimum requirement would be. What you'll find is that just about in every water test I've ever seen is that the standard rates of addition are more than sufficient to cater for the amounts of antagonistic ions present.
Great, Andrew. So we've talked a bit about the different salt formulations. We've talked a bit about the water and sort of water limitations. So I guess the next part of the puzzle is the environment and the weeds. So can we sort of focus on that a little bit?
Yep. Well, it's pretty self-evident that environmental stress drives the plant processes that are inhibited by glyphosate. but they also inhibit the processes that facilitate glyphosate uptake. So in other words, when a plant is actively translocating and actively growing, there is that situation at the point of the leaf surface and below the leaf surface where there's transport of solutes happening at a fairly good rate. What that means is that because we've already identified that the uptake of glyphosate's pretty much driven by a concentration gradient through diffusion, while over that diffusion gradient is maintained, there's possibility of further glyphosate uptake. The other factor, of course, is being that glyphosate needs to be in a semi-soluble state on the leaf surface. So when the plant metabolism is inhibited by water stress, low light intensity, nutrient stress, the amount of movement of nutrients or translocation around the plant is inhibited, and therefore that possibility of maintaining a concentration and gradient to facilitate glyphosate uptake is reduced. So that's most obviously driven in a moisture stress situation, because we get the plant adapting to low soil water. They'll undertake defensive mechanisms to stop transpiration losses, translocation stops, and so what you find is that glyphosate, a limited amount of glyphosate is absorbed by the plant and also translocated, so it's far less effective under those conditions. Moisture stress is not so much of a problem in winter, although it can be under very low soil water conditions, particularly in soils with low water holding capacity and where you get an early break in the season and then a dry period following, but more likely in summer. And some of the weeds that particularly exercise us there are things like button grass, liverseed or Eurocloa grass, or Spania grass, some of the broadleaf such as red pigweed, and some of this is due to the fact that they have a fibrous root system, also due to the fact that they also are present at very high densities and sometimes are present in very high densities on lighter textured soils which have lower water holding capacities.
What about temperature, Andrew?
Temperature is a big thing in situations where we get temperatures, typically maximum temperatures, typically getting over 36 degrees on sequential days. So what we call a heat wave, and we get into the high 30s, low 40s, or even more in some cases. The plant, in many cases, just shuts down. There is an optimal range for even C4 plants, which means that at certain temperatures the metabolism just ceases to function in the same way as it would at lower temperatures, and therefore there's no longer the driver for both glyphosate uptake and translocation. Unfortunately, when we do get into a period of days at very high temperatures, we can't just simply spray at night and get away with it. The plants under those conditions are typically just slowing their metabolism until such time the temperatures drop below the 37, 36 degree mark. So what's the strategy? The strategy is to get to spray early in that heat wave sequence. So if it's day 1 or 2, it's probably better to do that unless you can see an early end to the heat wave and not in the meantime lose all the soil water that's available to drive plant growth.
Okay, I guess the final part of the puzzle is spend a couple of minutes just talking about where we know we're going with tank mix compatibilities or incompatibilities. So is there specific combinations that you've seen over the years that you've been playing around with glyphosate, particularly focusing on some of the northern mixtures and areas where we need to watch?
Yes, there are, and the main 3 classes of chemistry that do cause us some issues sometimes with incompatibility, I'm talking about biological incompatibility here, are our group I's, which are all the auxin type herbicides. So the main ones that are potentially antagonistic to glyphosate, particularly on grasses, are 2,4-D, dicamba and fluroxapyr or starane. There are other group I herbicides that don't cause us any issue at all, such as Lontrol and Garlon. Now, the science of this is that in the case of 2,4-D, there is a binding together, I guess, for want of a better word, of the 2,4-D molecule and the glyphosate molecule, making it less readily absorbed. There are some indirect effects of the herbicides on plant growth as well that may contribute to reduced performance on summer grasses. The other groups that are of concern to us are the group Cs, which are the photosynthetic inhibitors. So those are things like atrazine, simazine, diuron, terbuthyrazine, and you can add to that. So those inhibit photosynthesis in the plant. So when they're co-applied with glyphosate, you tend to find that the performance of glyphosate is very much inhibited, and sometimes irreversibly so, to the point where you'll get unsatisfactory control of our summer grasses. So if you can avoid using group C herbicides with glyphosate in the summer in particular, that would be advisable because of that inhibition that's been caused by the companion group C. The final group that's quite concerning at times, particularly under conditions of high light intensity, are the group Gs. So these include oxyfluorophane or GOL, cafentrazone, flumioxazine and cyclophenazole. And the reason for that is that some of these companion herbicides cause a lot of local light-induced leaf necrosis at the site of the droplet impact. And so what we get is damage to the plant occurring simultaneous to the application of glyphosate and an early termination of glyphosate uptake. So that can really impact glyphosate activity on certain grasses and broadleaf weeds.
What about oils with glyphosate, Andrew?
The main reason for not including oils with glyphosate was centred around the antagonistic effect of petroleum spray oil adjuvants in particular with glyphosate on Hardness barnyard grass. And because it was such a universal weed in northern Australia, or northern New South Wales and southern Queensland at least, the story went out that it was simply not advisable to use oils with glyphosate with those in the summer in particular. Now, the vegetable-based oils, the esterified canola oil adjuvants, aren't quite as antagonistic from that point of view, but on occasions they can slightly take away the activity of glyphosate on the summer grasses. Not so for the winter grasses where they can be quite happily included there.
Great. I think we've sort of probably got to the end of the time that we had allocated for the webinar. So again, thank you to Andrew for his time this morning to come and talk to us about glyphosate. So at that point in time, I'll call the webinar to a close, and we'll talk to you again later. So thanks, everybody.